So there is really no reason for Europe not to move significantly faster. And of course, after the invasion, we have, for instance, seen the Esbjerg Declaration in May last year, et cetera, et cetera. So a number of, I would say, big, large political initiatives have been taken. Now we have to implement them. And that is really the challenge ahead of us.
While the energy transition is still progressing, we can see that high food prices, inflation, the energy crisis with roaring energy prices are distracting from climate targets in many places. In some cases, even the switch from coal to gas is being reversed. According to latest research by DNV, overall we are a far cry from the Paris Agreement and we're heading for 2.2 degrees global warming in the next 80 years. In its latest edition of the Energy Transition Outlook, DNV analyzed the development and trajectory until up to 2050 and provides recommendation on how the world can still meet its climate targets. So where are we headed on this journey? Ditlev Engel, CEO of Energy Systems at DNV, will tell us. Welcome to the Smartery podcast, a podcast for and with the creators of the new energy world. A world in which energy will be renewable, decentralized and digital, bringing together electricity, heat and mobility. Let us show you how we will get there and who will get us there. As already mentioned, I'm very pleased that we have the chance to talk to the CEO of DNV Energy Systems himself, Ditlev Engel. DNV as such is a international classification society and service provider in the fields of technical consultancy, engineering services, certification and risk management based out of Norway. And within DNV, Ditlev heads the business area Energy Systems with more than 4,000 energy experts behind him. Prior to this, Ditlev was the group president and CEO of global wind turbine manufacturer Vestas Wind Systems. So it's fair to say he is a veteran in the field. Welcome, Ditlev.
Thank you very much.
Really awesome to have you. And let's cut right to the chase. So what kind of speed are you still seeing in the renewable energy power system transition? And will the roaring prices at the moment, when it comes to energy prices, have a negative effect on the investments in clean energy?
Well, thank you, Zach. These are very big and complicated questions. So let me just try to chop them up in, let's say, in three instances. When it comes to what it's all about is to reduce the impact of greenhouse gas emissions. We are not in a good place in the world. We keep going in the wrong direction. And as you mentioned, we have said in our report that in order to reach the Paris Agreement, we have to cut emission by at least 8% every single year from now going forward. And just to put that into perspective, when we were all sitting at home because of COVID-19, we in the world managed to do 6%. Now that you can only do once, you can only stop flying once. So what do you do the following year? So it's very clear that when it comes to the reduction of emissions, we are definitely not in a good place in the world. Now, so that is one thing which is, of course, very alarming and means we have to move very fast. The second item that you mentioned here is obviously how are we then doing on the build out of renewables and other mitigating energy industries, technologies. I would have to say that the good news is that the cost curve for those technologies is very, very strong, meaning that they keep coming down and that they actually can scale very, very fast. However, we do not manage to scale them fast enough. I'm sure we'll talk about that later, but they have the possibility to do so. So this is the very good news and what we need to bank on. And the third part, as you mentioned, the cost of energy. We have to separate between what is the cost that we pay and what it costs to produce. And what we have seen in Europe now, obviously, is due to the shortage of gas over 2022, has created this very high increases in the cost for us to buy the energy. But that is actually maybe more a fossil fuel challenge rather than an energy challenge. And therefore, we need to hang on to two things, and that is that the cost going forward from producing the renewables is very strong. And we also know that we have to scale it very fast. And that is where we really have to put our focus.
So it's a mixed scenario. We're still standing in front of a huge mountain that we still need to climb. There's no way that we can lean back and relax at the moment. At the same time, you say cost coming down will unleash a positive dynamic, but the whole pricing policy with the involvement of fossils is still something that needs to be untangled. Speaking of fossils, usually Europe prides itself in having a leadership role in the global energy transition, despite some minor setbacks. But how is that looking now with replacing, I think, around about 10% of Russian gas with actual coal, something that we didn't really want to speak about anymore?
Yeah, so we made a study a few months after the invasion of Ukraine, where we looked at what would happen if in 2023, 80% of the gas supplies from Russia would be taken away and 100% in 2025. And what we could see in that scenario was that we would have to do a lot of things, like, for instance, increase the emission of coal, things we didn't want to do, but that actually meant that we would be able to sort of scramble through as Europe and keeping the lights on as Europe. At the same time, it also showed that the dependency has now taken a very prominent role in our future energy strategies. And thereby, by building out renewables much, much faster, we actually will achieve two things. We will reduce the dependency, number one, and number two, the cost of the renewables is still very, very attractive. We actually have in our energy transition outlook a very positive outlook for wind, for solar, for the cost of batteries, etc., etc. And actually, this business case has only become stronger. So one can say that the arguments for accelerating the transition, both from a carbon perspective, but also from an energy dependency perspective, have become much, much stronger. And the interesting thing is that it has actually only also a positive effect on the economics of because it gets cheaper and cheaper to produce and to scale. So there is really no reason for Europe not to move significantly faster. And of course, after the invasion, we have, for instance, seen the Esbjerg Declaration in May last year, etc., etc. So a number of, I would say, big, large political initiatives have been taken. Now we have to implement them, and that is really the challenge ahead of us.
Now, as we speak and record this podcast, the invasion into the Ukraine isn't even 11 months past us at the start of it. So it's a fairly fresh development. And of course, that's led to really a steep decline in Europe's gas consumption. But if we look at a longer time frame, if we look up to 2050, what kind of developments are you expecting then in regards to the gas consumption in the European energy mix?
So obviously, because of the situation in Ukraine and the fact that we do not foresee that the gas is going to come back, obviously the gas situation in Europe has changed a lot because of this. And that, of course, also means that in order to deliver on our climate ambitions, we have to scale the renewables much, much faster than what we initially anticipated. Right now in the world, we are in a situation where 20% of the total energy mix is non-fossil and 80% is fossil. And in order to meet the Paris Agreement, you can say we have to change that by 2050, i.e. 20% fossil and 80% non-fossil. And if we are then going to reach the Paris Agreement in the world, we know that the starting point for many nations are very different. So we would actually in Europe have not just to go to net zero, we would have to go to minus, i.e. also using carbon capture and storage. The same in North America, because if we do not do this in the developed economies, then it would be impossible, we believe, for the world to reach the Paris Agreement. So some have to do more than zero. And Europe is in that position. So getting to net zero by 2050 will, in our view, not be enough. So we have to do even more. So I would just say that the urgency for scaling faster is there, just is flashing on all levels. And that means that the build out that needs to happen in Europe in the coming years just has to go much, much faster.
I love that sentiment that you really see us in a leadership role and having also to take up responsibility for going net zero. An interesting sentiment to say, it's not, what about China, but it's because of China we actually need to do more and be better. Now, we talked so much about gas consumption going back, but because in Germany, particularly wind and solar energy hasn't been on such a huge supply in the last weeks in winter, because as we speak, it's still winter in Germany. So we actually used more gas to generate electricity again. How will we get through winters in Europe in the future?
Well, the first thing I would say is, I think in Germany, people have reacted very fast in building up new LNG capacity. If we were at fast to build out the renewables as building a LNG terminal, then that would be really good news. So I think the answer, like so many other ways of walks of life, is in the mirror. That so how we will deal with this in Europe in the coming winters depends entirely on what we do every single day going forward now. How fast we will scale up the permitting and planning, how fast we will place the orders for the build out of offshore wind, how fast we will be in building out the grid, etc., etc. The interesting thing is, and this is something that we are often being asked at DNV, about where are we on the technologies? And here I think it's very important to say that we are very technology optimistic. We actually do believe, to use your analogy from before, when you stand in front of this tall mountain, we actually have all the tools to climb the mountain. The problem is that we don't use them, and we don't use them fast enough. So this is very much about an implementation challenge now. It is not a technology challenge. And then it is really all about, to get through these winters, how much capacity do we have to build, by when, how fast? That is really what we need to focus on. And so it is, I would say it is probably maybe more a mindset that we need to have rather than a technology discussion. I have to say, if there's one thing we learned from the COVID crisis, was that if we really have to change very fast, you can get the whole world to change very fast. So if we had the same mindset about dealing with the coming winters in Europe and mitigate the emissions, it is not technology which is holding it back. It is the way that we have decided to operate. So it is a scaling and implementation challenge and a mindset challenge that we need to overcome. But it is not a technology challenge.
That somehow sounds like good and bad news at the same time to me. Because good news that it's not a technical challenge, that it's actually feasible if we decide to do it. And on the other hand, bad news because changing a mindset and a culture is something so untangible. It's always a tricky thing because it's like a soft factor. So I really hope that we actually learn from what we're able to achieve during the last months, and we just take this as a blueprint for the coming years. Now, it's also sort of like a little superstorm of various crises combining itself. We spoke about the invasion into the Ukraine and the effects it had. We also, on top of that, have we see a lot of inflation in various regions around the world. And we see interrupted supply chains still going back due to COVID. So how are the last two challenges affecting the renewable sector?
I'm a great believer in that you should never look at the waves, you should look at the current. And we have a tendency in the world, because we live in a minute-to-minute media world. What happened yesterday? What will happen tomorrow? But energy is not like that. Energy is about decades of planning, decades of understanding. And here, the good news really is that electrification of the world is a very robust trend. Everything will electrify. Just look at our vehicles, look at the whole way we work, and it will digitalize at the same time. So we need to power our societies and the progress in the world. We need massive electrification. So the choice that we have to make now to make sure we maintain this progress is to find out, how do we create non-CO2 emitting technologies that can do that, and at the same time reduce the dependency. And thirdly, how can we also ensure that it is economical viable? And it is, and this is what I said before, the cost of those technologies will keep coming down. Actually, in order to get to the pathway that we have made to net zero, which actually means meeting the Paris Agreement, we are today spending just below 4% of the global GDP on energy cost. And if you go into a full decarbonized energy systems on the 80-20 that I mentioned before, then you would actually end up in a situation that you will spend less of your global GDP on energy costs compared to what we do today. So you will, and of course, we also have to remember that this is just the cost for the energy. Then there are all the associated costs from the effect of climate, etc., that needs to be factored in as well. So I'm saying that the business case is very robust. It basically ticks all the boxes of what we want to do on the carbon, etc., etc. The key question is to say, so you maybe say it's pessimistic because it's the people. On the other hand, I will have to say it is much better that we have the technology and that we are challenged on the mindset rather than we have the right mindset, but we don't have the technologies. A bit like what we saw under COVID where we didn't have the vaccines. Now we have the vaccines. So it's the same thing here. We do have the technology. It is all about implementing it. And the view that we have from DNV is what can we do to give people the confidence to really scale much faster and mitigate what is perceived as risk by many from the technologies, to try to give them the trust and confidence that it is not a risk. It is actually a much more riskier not doing it.
And if I also understand it correctly, and I love that perspective as well, is what you said, that changing an energy system is really a fundamental long-term undertaking, is that okay, maybe we might need to wait on that one specific solar panel a few months or on that car, but actually there's so much planning, strategy and culture change to be done that we can use this time very wisely. And it's not like we have to wait until inflation or supply chain issues are being solved, because there's just so much work to do. Coming back, there's so much mountain to climb still.
And just to, as you mentioned, I have been closely connected to this over the last nearly 20 years now. And I remember when the first offshore wind farm was done on a larger scale, it was 160 megawatts and it was 82 megawatt turbines. And at that time, we all thought, imagine if you could make a 3 megawatt turbine. Then you would have, wow, that would be a breakthrough. Now look at where we are today. And the size of the offshore wind parks that we are building, which are in the gigawatts, and the machines are double digit, etc. And it just continues. And if anybody 20 years ago have said, do you think that we will do gigawatt offshore wind parks with 15, 16, 17, whatever megawatts machines? People said, oh, are you crazy? It can never happen. Yeah, and all the cars will be running on batteries. No, this is insane. So I think we should be very mindful of do not underestimate technology. What technology can do, but technology will evolve when you implement it and when you work with it. And the reason why we have seen such a strong development in offshore wind is because we started on a smaller scale, and then we have all the time kept innovating, kept finding new ideas, working together in industry projects, different suppliers, new ideas. People have been innovating, and that's how you take technology forward. And therefore, the key issue here is really to get going and really learn as we go. And then we will keep on finding new ways. And I think we have seen that number of times again. Don't underestimate the technology, but get going. That is the real message, because then we will actually find even more exciting ways going forward.
Get going and trust in the unimaginable to happen in the future. Now, if you allow me just to dive into some nitty-gritty details nevertheless. If we look into inflation and supply chain issues, do you see some sectors being more affected than others? For example, solar being more affected than electric vehicles, or the other way around?
I think, again, as I said, the fact that we have had COVID, the fact that we have the war in Ukraine, where a lot of the supply chain have been bombed or taken away, has obviously been a massive disruption. But my point here is, this is a short-term phenomenon that we have to deal with and work our way through. But if I look at the fundamental cost and the supply chain of supplying the products we need, then once we have worked our way through both COVID and that situation, which have disrupted the supply chain for sure and also increased the cost a lot, there is nothing which shows that this is not the right way forward, also from a cost perspective, that we have what we need from a supply chain perspective once things get more normalized, and the cost expectations for what it costs to produce will keep coming down, also as we scale the technologies even more. And that is one of the reasons why, for instance, we at DNV have said we do think that, for instance, oil will plateau or will peak around 2030, simply because of the electrification of the whole transport sector. So we should not underestimate that there will be a massive movement as we electrify. And the reason for that is, again, cost, because the cost of producing, for instance, an electrical car is coming down a lot and will continue to do so over the coming years. And those things we have to take into account when we plan, as I said, for the long haul. And that is actually why we made the Energy Transition Outlook. And if anyone is interested in listening to this, they can download it free on our website, where you can see our expectations to the cost development of the technologies. And that is, of course, also built on the cost of the supply chains, to your question.
Now, you said, let's get going. And if we come back to the bigger picture again, actually, for the first time in your study, you also outlined a concrete roadmap how to achieve the climate goals. So where do we stand there, and how would that roadmap look like?
Yeah, so that's what I said before. I mean, so we have made this what we call the pathway to net zero, because if we make a forecast based upon how we think the cost will evolve and the technologies evolve, we see a world where we will get to 2.2, 2.3 degrees centigrade. And there is, just to underline this, there's a massive difference whether it will be 2, 2.1, 2.2, 2.3. It doesn't sound a lot for us as humans, but for climate, it has a huge difference. So getting to 1.5, which was the intention of the Paris Agreement, we have made this what we call the pathway to net zero. And the pathway to net zero is modeling the world, split it into 10 regions on the starting points of the regions, and then at the same time look at who has to do what. And there, as I mentioned earlier, that means that, for instance, we in Europe have to go to minus, the same in North America. Otherwise, we won't get to the 1.5 in order to get to the realistic level of emissions, because there are some countries starting on a complete different place, and they simply cannot do it at the same speed as we will, for instance, will be able to do in Europe. And therefore, some of us have to be even more ambitious than a zero. We have to go to minus. And that's what the pathway to net zero. It is basically call it a recipe or a roadmap of saying, if you want to achieve the Paris Agreement, how much and which technologies do you have to implement, how fast and where? And that's what you can see in that roadmap.
Now, you said 10 different regions. Some of these regions are more challenged than others. Maybe can you give us one or two examples of countries that are looking at particularly strong challenges?
Well, it's clear that we, for instance, all of us in Europe have basically access to electricity. There are many parts of the world where do not have that. And obviously people want to have that. So therefore, the increase in energy consumption will definitely go up in some countries, where we, for instance, in Europe, believe it's going to fall quite a lot. Actually, we do believe that each of us as individuals in Europe will have a 50% reduction in our own energy consumption. Because as we get much more renewables, as we digitalize, as we integrate our system, many of the losses in the systems are going to disappear. So we will actually see a contraction of our total energy consumption, whereas obviously in countries like India and China, they will increase their energy consumption because today it is very, very low. And therefore it's important that when they are now expanding their energy consumption, that they do it on renewables and not, for instance, built out of coal-fired power plants. And these are, of course, the things that it also, as people talk about, has to be an equitable energy transition, which means that it shouldn't be just that people do not also get access to electricity, like, for instance, we have had for many, many years and benefited from, because this is also very important for the progress of society. But we have to do it in a decarbonized way. And that means that each country has to have different starting points, but also different strategies of how to get there. There is not a one-size-fits-all. And that needs to be taken into account from the starting point. But actually, those of us here in this part of the world, we will actually see a reduction of our total energy consumption. Not from electrification, because we will electrify much more, but total energy consumption will go down.
And just to put some numbers to it, I think the number that I have in my head is that just in sub-Saharan Africa, there's more than 700 million people who are still waiting for a connection to the energy grid or to a mini grid to local energy production, which is a staggering amount. And as you said, we're talking about the absolute basics here, just having an LED light to be able to read or work at night. Now, what I'm surprised by is that you say that we are actually able to take down our overall energy consumption, just if at the same time you look at how digitalization, for example, is ramping up with a huge demand for electricity as well. So maybe as a last statement, because that's something that the IPCC or the COP26 is also calling for, is that we really need to reduce our CO2 emissions. What measures could we take to really take down the emissions and also the energy consumptions, as we at the same time in other areas are ramping up the need for energy?
You know, I have to say simplicity is an art. And we have over many, many years at the COP seen many pledges about something we will do in 30, 40 years from now. So it will be a bit like me saying to you, you know, in 2035, I will lose 5 kilos. Okay, great. But it's probably more impressive if I tell you that in 2023, I will start out by losing 2 kilos, and I will send you every month a progress of how I'm doing that. My point being here is we need to measure in a different way. We know we have to bring down the emissions globally 8% every single year. So it's not good enough to talk about that we will do something in 2050. That's fine. But if we don't back it up with actually progress every single month in 2023, 24, 25, 26, 27, so we can actually see that things are happening, either in the build out of the capacity we need and the overall reduction from our daily way of life, then we won't get there. Then we already have lost a lot of years from when we signed the Paris Agreement to where we are now. As far as I know, in 2022 will probably be the highest emissions ever, which is totally against what we agreed in Paris. So therefore, if we do not implement and measure in a different way, we won't get a different result. So I think that is critically important, that we really measure much more frequently and report on it much more frequently. And that I would be much more impressed, to be honest, if a country said, next year we will take it down by 4%, this is how we'll do it. And the following year we'll take it 4% and we will report on it every month. Then you can actually start to see that you have, let's say, the right development.
I love that. And even though it might seem simplistic to compare it to losing weight, but the analogy to it that it brings about is that we actually need a fitness tracker that keeps constant tracking of our daily progress, which also has some sort of gamification side to it. If you have a constant feedback on your progress, it gives you a positive stimulus to continue. You can compare yourself to other countries. There's a competition starting. I love that sentiment to bring it really into the very present, even if it's just small steps, but make it very concrete. I think that's a wonderful approach to it and probably a very effective measure. Thanks so much, Ditlev. So there were a lot of insights, but I think the most important really was the last one. You said, make it really measurable in the here and now, not in the far distant future, and really have a look into the mindset and into the cultural perception of where we're heading. Because as you said, the technology is there. Luckily, that bit is solved, and that bit also will improve. As you said, that what we see now is just a step onto an even higher technological level in a few years. So we're really covered on that track, but we really need to start implementing. We need to start scaling that mountain and make use of the ingenuity we have and really adapt our lifestyle and our energy system. Thanks so much, Ditlev.
Thank you so much for having me, Zach.
Everything about the latest developments around decentralized, digital and renewable energy or mobility can be found on the Smarter E Europe, Europe's largest platform for the energy industry. Learn more online at thesmartere.de.